My twin sons were every mother's dream, tall, handsome, funny, and brilliant. They never fought over toys, grades, or even attention. But who could have imagined that one day they would nearly tear our family apart because of a woman? Yes, I'm talking about my eldest son's wife, that young, fiery beauty who could make any man lose his mind and every mother-in-law lose her peace. Do you want to know what I had to witness, what I had to endure as a mother? Then sit down, my dear, let me tell you my story. And before we begin, comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. You'll need to hear how Karma played her part. 8 months after disappearing without a word, she came back. I still remember the sound of her knock that morning, steady and confident, like she already knew she would be let in. When I opened the door, Liliana stood there dressed like she had just walked out of a magazine. In her arms was a baby wrapped in a pale blue blanket, sleeping quietly. Her first words cut through the air like a blade. "Mother, this is Dominic's son." For a moment I couldn't move. 8 months ago, she vanished. No phone calls, no explanations, just silence. I searched. I waited. But eventually we stopped talking about her. And now she stood here holding a baby who had my son's eyes. My voice came out smaller than I expected. "Where have you been, Liliana?" She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that always meant she was hiding something. "I had to leave," she said softly. "Things were complicated. I just needed time." Her tone was calm, rehearsed polite, too polite. I stepped aside, letting her enter, though my stomach turned at every step she took inside my house. She looked around like a guest visiting a museum, her eyes pausing at the framed photo of Dominic on the piano. The baby stirred and let out a small cry. Liliana adjusted the blanket, pretending to be the picture of a gentle mother. But when our eyes met, I saw it that same gleam of calculation I had seen before, when she first talked about inheritance, when she asked too many questions about the house and the trust fund. Grandson, the word felt heavy in my chest. I looked at the baby again, so innocent, so unaware of the poison floating in the air between us. My hands trembled slightly. I wanted to believe her, but every instinct told me she had come back not for family, but for something else. She sat down on the couch without asking, smoothing her skirt like she owned the place. I made tea out of habit, though I didn't touch mine. She talked about doctors' birth certificates and paperwork, all the things someone mentions when they want to make their claim sound legitimate. I listened, but inside I felt the ground shifting. When she finally placed the baby on her lap and looked straight at me, her smile softened. "Mother, I know Dominic would want his son to have everything he deserves." That's when I realized what she really came for. Not reconciliation, not love. She came to claim her share of what she thought was hers. Liliana placed the baby gently on the couch, then reached into her designer handbag with a calm, practiced motion. From it, she pulled a thick folder neatly clipped documents with official seals, birth certificates, and what appeared to be DNA test results. The paper at the top carried a red stamp that read, "Lab test verified." It looked legitimate, but something about it felt rehearsed, staged too perfect. She cleared her throat and began speaking with the composure of someone who had memorized her lines. "Mother, I believe it's time we discuss what's fair. Dominic's son has a legal right to this property and everything under his name. Ohio inheritance law is clear about the rights of a biological child, even one born out of wedlock." Her tone was formal, precise, almost clinical. Each word came out like it had been rehearsed in front of a lawyer. I sat still, my fingers tightening around the porcelain cup. The tea trembled, catching the morning light. For a second, I didn't answer. I simply watched her. Her crossed legs, her flawless nails, her false calm. She wasn't speaking like a grieving widow or a mother protecting her child. She was negotiating. In my years at the bank, I'd heard this kind of language before. The tone of someone who came not to ask, but to claim. My instinct screamed that every line she spoke had been written by someone else, probably a lawyer she hired long before showing up at my door. I looked down at the document, scanned the legal jargon about custodial rights and entitled inheritance. It was clever, I had to admit. Every word chosen to sound irrefutable. "So that's what this is," I said quietly, meeting her gaze. "You came back to talk about the will." Liliana didn't flinch. Her lips curved into a polite smile. "I came back for my son's future," she replied smoothly. "And I'm asking you, Mother, to include him in Dominic's inheritance. It's only right." The word asking rang hollow. She wasn't asking, she was informing me. Every sentence was a move on a chessboard. My heartbeat slowed as realization settled in. This wasn't a visit. It was an ambush wrapped in family language. I placed my cup down carefully, not trusting my hands to stay steady. I wanted to speak to remind her that inheritance isn't just about law. It's about truth, about love, about who stood beside you when everything fell apart. But I said nothing. Not yet. I just looked at the woman across from me, the one who had once called me Mom, and realized I was staring at a stranger armed with paperwork and ambition. Upstairs, the air was heavy with the steady rhythm of machines. Dominic lay motionless, his chest rising and falling under the quiet control of the ventilator. A soft mechanical hum filled the room, the kind of sound that could drive you mad if you listened long enough. I came here every morning, every evening, sometimes in the middle of the night when sleep wouldn't come. I talked to him as if he could still hear me, telling him about the garden, the neighbors, the way the light hit his favorite window at noon. Maybe it was foolish, but it was all I had left of my son, my voice reaching into the darkness where he was trapped. A year had passed since the accident. The doctors called it a miracle that he survived at all. But I stopped believing in miracles the day Liliana stopped coming. At first, she said she was busy, work was overwhelming. Life had been hard since the crash. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think grief made her distant. But weeks turned into months, and not once did she show up. Not once did she call to ask how he was breathing, eating, surviving. When she finally returned, dressed like she was walking into a meeting instead of a hospital room, I asked her softly, almost pleading, "Liliana, why haven't you called me? Not even once in 8 months." She looked away, adjusting her hair, her voice smooth and empty. "I needed time to heal," she said. Those words hung in the air like a blade. Heal. Heal from what? From her husband's accident? Or from the guilt of knowing something I didn't? The silence that followed felt colder than the hospital floor. I watched her fingertips trace the edge of the baby's blanket, her eyes fixed anywhere but on Dominic. I knew then that her distance wasn't grief. It was avoidance. She wasn't healing, she was hiding. I sat by Dominic's bed after she left, holding his limp hand. His skin was pale veins visible beneath the hospital light. My throat tightened as I whispered, "Son, what did she do to you?" His fingers didn't move, but I could almost feel the weight of his unspoken answer. The truth was somewhere in that silence, a truth she was desperately trying to bury under polished lies and legal documents. Downstairs, the house still smelled of her perfume. Too sweet, too strong, the scent of someone trying to cover decay. Hunter came down the stairs just as I was clearing the teacups. The floor creaked under his shoes, that slow, hesitant rhythm that always gave him away when he was nervous. When he saw Liliana standing in the living room holding the baby in her arms, he froze mid-step. For a split second, something flickered in his face. Surprise, confusion, maybe even guilt before he composed himself. "Sister-in-law," "You're back," he said, his voice catching halfway through the sentence. He forced a smile, the kind people use when they're trying too hard to look natural. But his eyes didn't match the smile. They darted from Liliana to me, then back to the baby, never landing long enough to feel sincere. I watched him quietly, letting the silence stretch. Hunter and Dominic might have been twins, but they couldn't have been more different. Dominic was steady, direct, the kind of man who met your gaze even in pain. Hunter, on the other hand, always looked for the exit before a question was even asked. Liliana shifted slightly, adjusting the baby's blanket. Hunter's throat moved as he swallowed hard. Their eyes met just for a second, but that second was enough. It wasn't the look of two people meeting after a long absence. It was a glance charged with recognition, something intimate, and something they both wished hadn't happened in front of me. I felt it in my chest, that heavy tightening that comes when truth begins to whisper before it speaks. I had seen this before, not in families, but in boardrooms, in meetings, where men lied about money they had already lost. The eyes always gave them away. When people lie, their words stay still, but their eyes don't. They keep searching for somewhere to hide. Hunter rubbed the back of his neck, pretending to laugh. "What a surprise," he said too loudly. "I thought you were still in Miami." Liliana smiled, polite and mechanical. "Plans changed," she replied simply. The baby stirred, letting out a soft cry that cut through the tension. I took the sound as an excuse to step closer. Hunter stepped back instead. His gaze flickered again, quick, uneasy, and landed on the folder of documents on the table. I noticed the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands slipped into his pockets. He already knew what those papers were. I said nothing, just picked up the fallen spoon and placed it on the tray. My hands moved calmly, but inside, everything was shifting. I didn't need evidence, not yet. That one look between them had already told me enough. Lies always start small in the eyes, in the silence, before they grow into something that destroys everything. The sound came suddenly, slicing through the tension downstairs. A faint but rapid beeping echoed from the monitor on the second floor. For a heartbeat, I froze, unsure if it was real or just my imagination. Then instinct took over. I dropped the tea tray and ran up the stairs, calling his name. Dominic. The door to his room was half open, the faint hum of the ventilator louder than usual. When I reached his bedside, the world tilted. His eyes were open, weak, unfocused, but alive. My breath caught. For a moment, I couldn't move. I just stood there staring at him, my mind refusing to believe what I was seeing after 12 endless months of silence. Then I rushed forward, gripping his hand with both of mine. "Dominic, it's Mom. You're here, you're really here." My voice broke as tears filled my eyes. His fingers twitched faintly under my touch, dry and fragile. His lips parted, cracked and pale, trying to form words. I leaned closer, holding my breath, afraid that even a whisper might break the miracle. His eyes moved slowly around the room, trying to make sense of where he was. Then they found me. For a moment, it was just us, mother and son, breathing the same air again. But the moment didn't last. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Liliana's perfume entered before she did. She hurried to the bed, pretending surprise. "Dominic, oh my God, you're awake." Her voice trembled, but not from emotion. I knew the sound of fake tears too well. Dominic's eyes flickered past her, uncertain searching. Then, with what little strength he had, he turned his head slightly toward me and whispered, "Mom, do what she said." The words came out rough, torn from a dry throat. For a second, the room went silent. The monitor beeped faster, echoing like a heartbeat against the walls. Liliana froze, confusion flickering in her eyes. But I noticed something she didn't. Dominic wasn't looking at her when he spoke. His gaze, faint deliberate, was fixed on Hunter, who had just stepped quietly into the doorway. The brothers locked eyes for a brief moment, and in that silent exchange, something cold and unspoken passed between them. My heart clenched. The meaning of Dominic's words hung in the air like a secret code, one only he and I might understand. Did he mean agreement, or was it a warning? I reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, whispering through tears, "It's okay, my love. Rest now." But deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. The truth had just opened its eyes. People used to say our family was perfect. From the outside, maybe it looked that way. The neat lawn, the brick house with blue shutters, the twins who made it to college, and the widow who held everything together without ever asking for help. But perfection is only the surface. Beneath it, things were rotting slowly, quietly, like wood eaten from the inside out. I became a widow at 40. One foggy winter night on the Ohio Turnpike, a truck spun out of control and ended my husband's life in seconds. That night, I lost more than a partner. I lost the illusion that life could ever be fair. Dominic and Hunter were still in high school then. I remember sitting in that cold waiting room, my hands numb, wondering how I was supposed to raise two teenage boys alone, but I did. For 25 years, I worked at Cleveland National Bank, climbing from a junior analyst to head of risk management. Numbers, rules, order, they were my armor. Every expense was documented, every loan checked twice, every promise written down. Maybe that's why my sons grew up disciplined but distant. I taught them strength, not softness. Independence, not dependence. When I finally retired, I used my savings and bonuses to buy a 3-story home in Lakewood. It wasn't a mansion, but it had character: oak floors, wide windows, a small garden that caught the morning light. I thought it would be our place of peace, the home where I could grow old surrounded by my family. I didn't know it would one day become a battlefield. The neighbors admired us. They'd wave from their driveways and whisper things like, "Gloria Graham, the woman who raised twin boys all on her own. No man, no complaints." I smiled when I heard it, proud in the way only someone who's survived can be. But looking back, I see the irony. The thing they admired most, my strength, my independence, became the weapon used against me later. People mistake discipline for coldness and success for distance. My sons did too. Dominic grew into a man who worked too hard and loved too little. Hunter, always the shadow, learned to charm rather than earn. I thought I could manage both, just like I managed the numbers at the bank. But family isn't math. You can't balance it with rules. Now, when I sit in the same house, the silence feels heavier than it used to. The polished floors, the framed family portraits, the smell of old coffee, they all hold memories of a life that once looked perfect. And maybe that's what hurts the most. Perfection is fragile. All it takes is one secret, one betrayal, to break it beyond repair. Dominic was always the calm one. Even as a child, he preferred puzzles to playgrounds, silence to noise. When he spoke, it was with thought and precision. Every word weighed before it left his mouth. After college, he became a civil engineer, steady and grounded, the kind of man who built things meant to last. People said he was the mirror image of his father. Same quiet strength, same steady gaze. When Dominic entered a room, he didn't need to speak loudly. His presence alone commanded respect. Hunter, his twin, was the opposite in almost every way. He filled a space with laughter, with energy, with noise. He worked in marketing for an ad agency in downtown Cleveland, a world of color, speed, and clever slogans. He had an easy charm, the kind that drew people in. Friends adored him. Women noticed him, and he basked in the attention. Where Dominic saw logic and plans, Hunter saw chances and shortcuts. And yet, despite their differences, they shared a bond stronger than most brothers ever knew. They used to joke that they were two halves of one heartbeat. When they were boys, they'd finish each other's sentences, trade roles during school plays, even switch classes just to confuse their teachers. As they grew older, their paths split, but their loyalty didn't. Whenever life got hard, Hunter would still call Dominic first, and Dominic, the steady one, always answered. I remember the night before Dominic's wedding. We sat on the porch, the air soft with summer rain, the twins side by side. They made me a promise the kind sons make to a mother who's given them everything. We'll never let anyone come between us, Mom Hunter said, his arm slung casually around Dominic's shoulder. No woman, no money, no pride. Dominic nodded, quiet as always, but the conviction in his eyes was real. I believed them. For years, that promise gave me peace. Even when their lives pulled them in different directions. One building highways, the other building brands. They always came home for Sunday dinners, joking like the boys they once were. I thought nothing could change that, but I was wrong. The change didn't come with thunder. It came softly, almost beautifully. A woman named Liliana Porter entered their lives, first through Dominic. She was graceful, intelligent, and charming in a way that made people drop their guard. When I met her, I understood how easily she could disarm anyone, even me. But beneath that warmth, there was something unreadable in her eyes. I should have noticed sooner. Because from the moment she appeared, the promise my sons made began to unravel thread by thread until the bond that once held us together dissolved into silence. Liliana entered our lives like perfume, pleasant at first, then impossible to wash off. She was 27, polished and magnetic. Her skin carried a warm bronze tone that caught the light like honey. Her eyes were an unnerving shade of blue, and her smile, that practiced dazzling smile, could convince anyone she was harmless. Anyone except me. The first time I met her was at Dominic's company Christmas party. The music was soft, the lights golden, and laughter floated through the room like bubbles. She wore a red silk dress that shimmered each time she moved, the kind of dress meant to be noticed. Everyone's gaze followed her, but hers didn't follow Dominic. It followed his wrist to the Rolex his father left him, the one Dominic wore only on special occasions. When she finally met my eyes across the room, she smiled politely. But there was calculation behind that sweetness, a subtle measuring. She was good at people, I'll give her that. She knew how to tilt her head just right when she listened, how to laugh lightly at someone's joke, how to sprinkle compliments like sugar, never too much, always just enough. When she joined us at the table, she leaned close, brushing Dominic's sleeve, and said with that honeyed tone, "Mrs. Graham, your son talks about you all the time. You must have raised him perfectly." The room melted at her charm. Even I smiled, though every instinct told me something was wrong. After that night, she was everywhere. She'd bring homemade cookies to our Sunday dinners offer to help in the kitchen, compliment my recipes, ask about my favorite books. She called me Mom before the engagement was even official. The neighbors adored her. My friends called her elegant, and Dominic looked at her like she hung the moon. I wanted to believe she was what she appeared to be, young, kind, full of love for my son. But love doesn't smell like expensive perfume or designer ambition. It doesn't linger in the air long after someone leaves the room. Liliana's scent did floral, intoxicating, almost predatory. There was something about her presence that made me uneasy, like standing too close to a flame that looked beautiful but could burn without warning. I told myself to stay quiet. Dominic was happy, and after years of loneliness, seeing him smile felt like a gift. So I silenced my doubts, tucked them away under politeness and prayer. But deep down, I knew. I knew the moment she said Mom, with that sugar-coated voice, that this girl wasn't just after love. She was after something that glittered far more than a wedding ring. And my silence, that one small act of kindness, would become my first mistake. After the wedding, Dominic and Liliana started their life together in a small apartment downtown Cleveland. It was modest but bright, a place that smelled of new beginnings and cheap coffee. For a while, they seemed happy. Dominic worked long hours at the firm, and Liliana posted pictures of home-cooked dinners and smiling mornings on social media, little snapshots of domestic bliss. But a year later, the tone changed. The posts stopped. The smiles faded. One evening, Dominic called and said they were struggling financially. Liliana had lost her PR job, he explained, and was looking for something new. Rent had become too high, and they needed to restructure their budget. I didn't want to interfere, but when he suggested moving back home to save money, I couldn't refuse. "The house is big enough for everyone," I said, trying to sound welcoming. "But everyone contributes fairly." I meant it kindly, but even as I spoke, something deep inside warned me that balance rarely survives under one roof. At first, Liliana was everything a mother could hope for in a daughter-in-law. She cooked, she cleaned, she called me Mom with that sweet, practiced warmth. She brought me tea in the evenings and laughed at my old stories as if she'd known me her whole life. For a few months, the house felt alive again, full of voices, smells of dinner, and the illusion of family harmony. Then slowly the mask began to crack. It started with small excuses. "I've been really anxious lately," she said one morning when I asked her to help with the laundry. "My therapist said I need to focus on my mental health." Soon, her self-care routine became a full-time occupation. She spent hours on the couch scrolling through her phone, ordering expensive organic food deliveries, and lighting candles that promised emotional balance. Meanwhile, the utility bills doubled. Groceries disappeared faster than I could replace them. I didn't say anything at first. Mothers never do, not until they have to. But one evening as I went through the receipts, I realized I was paying for nearly everything. The electricity, the internet, even the wine she liked to drink during her healing nights. So I tried to start a conversation as gently as I could. "Maybe we should sit down and discuss finances," I said. "It'll help keep things fair for everyone." Liliana didn't get angry. She smiled that same calm, sugary smile and said softly, "Mom, we're family. Why do you need to calculate everything?" That sentence stayed in the air long after she left the room. It was polite but cold, a beautiful way of saying, "Your generosity is mine now." And for the first time, I felt it a chill deep inside my chest, the kind that whispers a truth you don't want to face. The house wasn't a home anymore. It was becoming something else, a quiet battlefield where kindness would soon cost more than money. At first, I thought nothing of it. Hunter had always been helpful, the kind of man who couldn't sit still when something needed fixing. He changed light bulbs without being asked, carried groceries for Liliana, and once spent half a Saturday repairing the washing machine. He said he was just helping his sister-in-law, and maybe he was. But soon his visits became more frequent than necessary. Every other day, he'd drop by claiming he was checking on the house. I began to notice small things, the way Liliana's tone softened when she spoke to him, the way his laughter lingered just a little too long around her. It wasn't what they did. It was how they did it. There was a lightness in their conversations that didn't belong between family. I told myself not to overthink, but unease has its own voice, quiet but persistent. One evening I woke up thirsty and went downstairs for water. The house was dark except for the dim light spilling from the garage. I paused, hearing soft laughter from behind the half-closed door. Liliana's voice playful, teasing, mixed with Hunter's deeper chuckle. "Don't tell anyone," she whispered. "This will be our little secret." Something inside me went still. I stood there, hand on the stair rail, listening as the sound of ice in a glass clinked softly. I couldn't make out the rest of their words, but I didn't need to. The tone said enough. When the laughter faded, I stepped back quietly and returned upstairs, but sleep never came. The next morning, I found Hunter in the kitchen, pretending to scroll through his phone. His face looked calm, almost too calm. I set my teacup down and said evenly, "Hunter, helping your sister-in-law is kind, but too much help can make people talk." He looked up startled. "Mom, I know what you were doing," I cut in gently. "Just remember, boundaries protect more than reputations. They protect families." A flush crept across his face. He nodded, avoiding my eyes, muttering something about fixing the garage light. But I saw it, the flicker of guilt, or maybe fear. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, my tea gone cold. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just laughter, just kindness. But I'd spent my life reading people, reading lies behind polite smiles. And that night, in the echo of their laughter, something had cracked. Not just my trust, but the fragile balance inside this house. We sat on the porch one late afternoon, the air heavy with the smell of rain. Hunter was fixing a loose hinge on the screen door, pretending not to notice that I was watching him. After a while, I spoke softly the way mothers do when the truth might hurt. "Son, don't let your sister-in-law pull you into her marriage problems. Whatever happens between them, stay out of it." He paused, screwdrivers in hand, and gave me that half smile he used when he wanted to change the subject. "Mom, don't worry. I just feel sorry for her, that's all. Dominic's been distant, and she seems so lonely." His words were casual, but his eyes weren't. There was something there. Something restless, unsteady. A flicker I didn't like. The boy I once knew, who used to blush when caught lying, was gone. In his place was a man who thought he could control danger simply by naming it compassion. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that helping her was just kindness, that empathy hadn't turned into something else. But mothers know. We feel the shift before it happens, the tremor before the storm. And in my house, I could already feel the walls holding their breath. Liliana's tone had begun to change too. At first, she'd call out playfully from the kitchen, "Hey, brother-in-law, can you help me with this?" But lately it was different. Softer, slower, like honey melting on words. "Hunter," she'd say now, her voice a whisper that didn't belong in daylight. Sometimes I'd hear it from the hallway. Just his name drawn out like a secret. I'd glance through this doorway and see them standing too close. The kind of closeness that happens gradually until it no longer looks wrong, because it's already become normal. She'd touch his arm while laughing or hand him a glass of lemonade, her fingers brushing his, just a little too long. Small things. Always small things. But that's how lines disappear, not with a fight, but with familiarity. One evening as I passed by the living room, I heard her laugh, low, intimate, meant for one listener. "You're the only one who really understands me, Hunter." The words weren't loud, but they hit me like a bell ringing inside my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker, my heart heavy with dread. There are moments when a mother knows she's losing control, not just of her family, but of the moral balance that keeps a home from collapsing. And that was the moment I knew. The danger wasn't just Liliana's charm. It was her power, the quiet, invisible kind that wraps around hearts and squeezes until no one can breathe without her permission. That weekend, Dominic suggested something unexpected. He called Hunter early Saturday morning and said, "Let's go golfing, just the two of us. It's been too long." I remember hearing his voice from the kitchen, steady but softer than usual, as if he was trying to make peace. The past few months had been tense, quiet dinners, awkward silences, the kind that filled a house even when no one spoke. So when I saw them drive off together, laughing like old times, I told myself it was a good sign. Maybe this was the day they'd fix whatever had broken between them. But by sunset, the phone rang. It was the police. There had been an accident on the interstate just outside Lake County. Dominic's car had gone off the highway and into a ditch. My mind refused to process the words that followed. No brake marks, no witnesses. Hunter survived with minor injuries. Dominic was in critical condition. Hours later at the hospital, I saw Hunter sitting in the hallway, a small cut on his forehead, his hands trembling. He looked shocked, but there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of confusion that didn't match his story. I asked what happened, and he took a long breath before speaking. "He must have fallen asleep at the wheel," he said. His voice cracked at the end too neatly, too rehearsed. The next day, I overheard him speaking with the police. This time, the story changed. A deer ran across the road. He told them, rubbing his temples, like the memory pained him. Dominic swerved to avoid it. I froze. Years of working in risk management had taught me one rule. People who lie always add details that don't belong. Truth is simple. Lies decorate themselves to sound real. I didn't say anything then, just watched him from across the corridor as he avoided my eyes. When I finally entered Dominic's room, the steady hum of the ventilator filled the silence. His face was pale, too still. I sat beside him holding his hand the way I used to when he was a child after a nightmare. My mind kept circling back to Hunter's words, the contradictions, the nervous laughter, the unnecessary explanations. Something about that crash didn't sit right. Dominic was always careful, especially when driving. He never sped, never drank, never lost control. So why now? And why was Hunter unharmed, except for a few scratches? As I watched the heart monitor blink in rhythm, a quiet truth began to settle in my chest. Cold, heavy, undeniable. This wasn't just bad luck. Something had shifted that day on the highway. Fate didn't take the wheel. Someone else did. In the first days after the accident, Liliana played the perfect grieving wife. She stayed at the hospital from morning till night, crying in the hallway whenever a reporter passed by. The local news aired her trembling voice, her tear-streaked face, her words repeated again and again. "My husband is my whole life. I don't know how to go on without him." People sympathized. Flowers arrived from strangers. Even the hospital staff looked at her with pity. But 3 weeks later, the performance started to crack. One morning, a call came from the bank, the same branch I had once worked at for 25 years. The manager, an old colleague, spoke carefully. "Mrs. Graham, I thought you should know. Mrs. Porter just submitted an authorization to withdraw from the joint account. A substantial amount." I remember standing by the hospital window looking out at the gray sky, my hand gripping the phone tighter. The hospital bills hadn't even been issued yet. Dominic's insurance covered most of the costs. There was no reason, no legitimate reason to touch that account. I asked how much she had withdrawn. The number made my stomach turn. When I checked later, the transaction had already gone through. The money was moved into a newly opened account, one under Liliana's name only. For household expenses, she had written in neat cursive on the form. But I'd seen too many forged justifications in my career to mistake a cover story for truth. That evening, I approached her gently, careful not to start a war in a hospital room. "Liliana, I said I saw the bank notification. What are you planning to use that money for?" She didn't even flinch. Her eyes stayed on her phone, scrolling through something mindless. "I know what I'm doing," she said. Her tone clipped cold, distant. Then she looked up, meeting my gaze for the first time in weeks. "You don't need to interfere in our finances, Mother." The word mother came out like an insult, smooth and sharp at once. For a long second, we just stared at each other. The girl who once called me Mom in a syrupy tone was gone. What sat before me now was someone different, composed, strategic, dangerous. I said nothing. Years of dealing with fraud and deceit had taught me that silence was often more powerful than accusation. But inside my mind was already turning connecting dots, recalling dates and patterns. When she walked away, Her heels clicking down the hall, I caught her reflection in the window. No tears, no grief, only calm precision. That was the moment I knew her morning had ended. The act was over, and the real Liliana, the one behind the perfume, the charm, the crocodile tears, had just revealed herself. 4 months passed, and the house had grown quiet, again too quiet. Dominic still lay in his hospital bed, the machines keeping his heartbeat steady, while I followed the same routine every day. Liliana rarely visited anymore, and when she did, it was only for a few minutes, wearing sunglasses indoors, and a perfume so strong it filled the hallway long after she left. Then one morning, she came downstairs with a small silver suitcase and a perfectly calm smile. "I'll be gone for a few days," she said, slipping on her coat. "Just a quick work trip." Something in her tone was rehearsed, not anxious, not apologetic, just final. I asked where she was going, and she gave a vague answer about a PR conference in Chicago. Then she kissed my cheek too lightly to mean anything and walked out the door. That was the last time I saw her. Days passed, then a week. I called her phone. It went straight to voicemail. I texted, emailed, even contacted her old office, no response. When I checked her room, she had left behind her wedding ring on the nightstand, a few dresses still hanging neatly in the closet, and a single bottle of perfume half empty on the dresser. It didn't look like she was planning to return. It looked like she wanted it to seem that way, as if she had evaporated on purpose. I reported her missing. The police took notes, asked routine questions, and opened a missing person case. But the investigation led nowhere. Her credit cards were inactive. No hotel check-ins, no airline tickets, no car rentals. It was as if someone had wiped her trail clean. Then came the detail that made my stomach twist. Exactly 1 week after her disappearance, I received a notification from the bank. Dominic's savings account, the one she had access to, had been drained again. $20,000 withdrawn in one transfer. The signature looked authentic, but the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. That same week, Hunter suddenly mentioned he'd landed a new freelance marketing project. He said it casually over dinner, tapping his fork against the table, avoiding my eyes. When I asked who the client was, he smiled faintly. "Just a private contract," he said. "Short-term, good money." The amount he mentioned, $20,000, matched exactly. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the ticking of the old clock loud enough to drown my thoughts. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was pattern recognition, the kind that never leaves you after years of analyzing risks. But deep down, I knew what my gut was telling me. Liliana hadn't disappeared. She had been helped to disappear. And whoever helped her had been sitting at my dinner table all along. Hunter started slipping away quietly, not all at once, but in the small, invisible ways that hurt the most. At first, it was simple. He missed dinner once or twice, saying he was working late. Then the nights away became more frequent, until the chair across from me at the table stayed empty most evenings. When I asked where he was going, he would smile, that tired, polite smile, and say, "Just work, Mom. I've got a few overnight projects lately." The words were smooth practiced, but the warmth that used to sit behind them was gone. The house began to feel different without him. Dominic's hospital room still echoed in my mind, the soft rhythm of machines following me into my dreams, and now even my surviving son was fading into the same kind of distance, alive but unreachable. Some nights, I waited up the lamp on pretending to read while I listened for his car in the driveway. But it never came. Then one morning, while sorting through a pile of mail on the counter, I noticed a folded piece of paper that wasn't mine. A hotel invoice tucked between advertisements and bills. My breath caught as I read the name printed in neat black letters, Hunter Graham. The hotel was in Pittsburgh. The dates matched one of his so-called work trips. I stared at the receipt, my heart thudding slowly. The charges included room service for two, a bar tab, and an additional late checkout fee. My hands trembled, as I turned the paper over, searching for any reasonable explanation. There was none. Hunter didn't work in Pittsburgh. He didn't even have clients there. When he came home that evening, I waited by the doorway. The moment he saw the paper in my hand, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition followed by guilt, then irritation. "You went through my things?" he asked sharply, his tone more defensive than shocked. "I didn't have to," I replied, my voice calm but heavy. It was right here in plain sight. For a moment, we just looked at each other. The air between us thickened, filled with everything we didn't say. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not what you think, Mom. It's just business. A client meeting, that's all." But he didn't hold my gaze when he said it. He turned away, grabbed his jacket, and left before I could respond. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house like a verdict. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the hotel receipt beside my cold cup of tea. I thought about the boy I raised honest funny, the one who used to promise he'd never keep secrets from me. Somewhere along the way, that boy had vanished, replaced by a man who couldn't even look his mother in the eye. And for the first time, I realized that the cracks in my family weren't just between mother and daughter-in-law or brother and brother. They had spread quietly right into the bond between a mother and her last remaining son. It was a quiet winter morning, the kind of silence that makes every sound sharper. The snow still covered half the walkway, and I was pouring my second cup of tea when a sudden, rapid knock broke the calm. It wasn't polite or hesitant. It was urgent, demanding the kind of knock that made your pulse quicken before your mind caught up. I froze for a second, the teapot trembling slightly in my hand. No one knocked on my door that early. When I opened it, the world seemed to tilt. Liliana stood there as if the months had folded in on themselves and erased the time she'd been gone. She wore a long beige coat dusted with snow, her hair perfectly curled, her makeup flawless despite the cold. In her arms was a newborn wrapped in a blue blanket, tiny and still. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, but her smile, that smile hadn't changed. Confident, controlled, dangerous. "Mother," she said softly, her voice as smooth as ever. "I know you must have missed your grandson." The words hit me like the shockwave. My hands shook the cup, slipping from my fingers. Porcelain shattered against the wooden floor, the sound sharp in the morning air. 8 months. 8 months without a call, without an explanation. 8 months of silence, of police reports, unanswered questions, and sleepless nights wondering whether she was alive or dead. And now here she was, standing on my porch, holding a baby with my son's eyes. I couldn't move. My throat tightened as I tried to find words, but all that came out was a whisper. "Where have you been, Liliana?" She tilted her head slightly, that familiar smile widening just enough to look practiced. "It's a long story," she said, brushing a bit of snow from the baby's blanket. "But I thought you'd want to meet him." Her tone was gentle, but her eyes, those cold blue eyes, were measuring everything. My expression, my hesitation, even the trembling in my hand. The smell of her perfume, expensive, heavy, suffocating, filled the doorway. It was the same scent I remembered from the night she disappeared. That scent alone made my stomach twist. For a moment, I just stared at her, unable to tell whether I was looking at a ghost or something worse. Someone who had returned not out of love, but out of purpose. There was no warmth in her face, no relief at being home, no trace of regret. Only confidence, the kind born from knowing exactly what she wanted. And I knew then she hadn't come back to make peace. She had come to collect. Liliana sat across from me at the dining table, her posture straight, her expression perfectly composed. The morning light poured through the window, glinting off the silver clasp of her folder as she opened it. One by one, she laid out the documents like cards in a game she already knew she would win. First, a birth certificate, crisp, freshly printed with the name typed neatly in black ink, Father Dominic Graham. Then a certified copy of her marriage certificate, complete with embossed seals and notary signatures. Everything was official. Everything was prepared. "I just want what's fair," she said, sliding the papers toward me with manicured fingers. Her voice was calm, but her eyes never left mine. According to Ohio inheritance law, a legitimate newborn has the right to inherit his father's estate, even if the father is currently incapacitated. Her tone was smooth, reciting legal language as if she had practiced it in front of a mirror. Each word was carefully chosen, precise, persuasive, and deadly. She wasn't pleading. She was presenting a case. I stared at the documents, my stomach tightening. 25 years in banking had made me fluent in the language of contracts and clauses. I recognized this for what it was, not an impulsive demand, but a carefully structured move crafted by someone who had done her homework. A lawyer's fingerprints were all over this, the timing, the wording, the confidence. "Liliana," I said quietly, trying to steady my voice. "Dominic is still alive. He hasn't signed anything. We don't even know." She cut me off with a faint smile. "That's why the law exists, Mother. To protect those who can't protect themselves." She paused deliberately, letting the word mother linger like a weapon. "Of course, if you refuse to acknowledge the child's rights, I'll have to let the court decide. You wouldn't want the Graham name dragged through legal disputes, would you? The press loves stories like that." There it was, the threat wrapped in silk. Not shouted, not vulgar, but delivered with the precision of someone who knew how to twist a knife without spilling a drop of blood. I felt my pulse in my throat, but I refused to look away. The sunlight reflected off the polished table between us, sharp as glass. "Are you trying to threaten me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She leaned back slightly, her lips curving. "Of course not. I'm just giving you options." In that moment, I realized what kind of war I was in. It wasn't about emotions or forgiveness anymore. It was about paperwork, signatures, and technicalities, the kind of war fought with pens instead of guns. And Liliana, with her sweet perfume and perfect calm, had just drawn the first shot. When Liliana began her speech about inheritance rights, the air in the room grew heavy. I sat still, watching her polished words unfold like a rehearsed script. Then the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Hunter appeared in the doorway, his hair still damp from the cold outside. He froze when he saw the baby. His eyes darted between me and Liliana, confusion flickering into something sharper, something I couldn't name yet, but it felt wrong. "Hunter," I said softly, trying to break the tension. He blinked as if waking from a trance, then stepped closer to the table where Liliana sat with the baby. For a moment, he just stood there, staring not at her, not even at me, but at the child. Liliana smiled faintly, that practiced, sugary smile. "You came just in time," she said smoothly. "I was telling Mother about the inheritance, about Dominic's rights and his son's." Hunter nodded stiffly, but his voice caught. "His son." The words barely escaped his lips. He reached out instinctively, brushing his fingers along the baby's chin, a simple gesture, but his hand trembled. It was small, subtle, but I saw it. The kind of tremor that doesn't come from shock, but from fear. My breath slowed. Years of reading faces in financial negotiations had trained me well. I could spot hesitation, deceit, guilt in a single glance. And Hunter's face, though composed, carried all three. Liliana turned to me again, her tone as soft as honey. "I just hope Dominic wakes up soon," she said, stroking the baby's head. "He deserves to see his son." That sentence seemed to slice the air. Hunter's body stiffened. His jaw tightened, and in that instant he turned away, pretending to adjust his sleeve. But I saw his eyes, just for a second, flick toward the window, wide and haunted, before he hid them behind a strained smile. No one else noticed. Liliana kept talking, her voice steady, her words smooth. But my mind had already left the conversation. I couldn't hear her anymore. I could only hear the silent scream of something deep inside me, the primal instinct that has no logic but never lies. It can't be, I thought. It can't. But my heart knew what my mind refused to say. That look on Hunter's face, the way his hand shook, the way he couldn't meet my eyes when she spoke of Dominic's son, told me the truth I wasn't ready to accept. There are many kinds of guilt, but only one kind that lives in the eyes. And my son's eyes were screaming it. That afternoon, the air in the hospital room shifted. For months, it had been filled with the steady, monotonous rhythm of machines, the slow beeping that had become the soundtrack of our lives. But suddenly, the monitor's tone changed. The beeps came faster, sharper, urgent. A nurse shouted something in the hallway, and within seconds, the room was full of movement footsteps, murmured instructions, the rustle of gloves. My heart leapt before my mind could catch up. I rushed to the bedside. Dominic's chest rose unevenly, his fingers twitching against the white sheet. I grabbed his hand, cold and fragile, in mine. "Dominic," I whispered, my throat tightening. "It's Mom. I'm right here, sweetheart." The words barely left my mouth before his eyelids flickered. For the first time in a year, they moved. Tears blurred my vision as I leaned closer. "Come back to me," I said softly, though my voice broke halfway through. Then miraculously, his eyes opened, slow, heavy, disoriented, like a man climbing out of a long, dark tunnel. The door burst open. Liliana rushed in, her heels clicking against the tile, her voice already trembling in rehearsed emotion. "Dominic. Oh my God, you're awake." She fell to her knees beside the bed, grabbing his other hand. "It's me. I'm here. And your son, your baby boy, he's waiting for you." Her sobs filled the room, perfectly timed, perfectly loud. For a moment, it might have looked genuine to anyone else. But I wasn't watching her. I was watching him. Dominic turned his head weakly. His lips parted dry and pale. "Mom," he whispered. The word was faint, but it was real. It carried a weight no one else seemed to notice. I leaned closer, tears spilling freely now. Then came the words that froze time itself. "Mom, do what she said." Liliana gasped, her hand tightening around his. "You heard him," she cried. "He agrees with me." But I didn't answer. Because while she smiled triumphantly through her tears, I saw where Dominic's eyes were truly looking. Not at her, not at me, but past her, straight to Hunter, who stood frozen in the corner, pale as the hospital walls. Their eyes locked for a split second, a silent exchange, something raw and unspoken passing between them. And in that instant, I understood. Dominic's words weren't agreement. They were warning. The room went still, so still that even the air seemed to stop moving. The only sound left was the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator, each breath, mechanical and steady, echoing through the sterile walls. For a long moment, no one spoke. Liliana broke the silence first, a sob catching in her throat before spilling into the quiet. She covered her face with trembling hands, her shoulders shaking as if the weight of 8 months of guilt had finally crashed down. "He forgave me," she whispered between sobs, her voice fragile and trembling. "He forgave us." Her words hung in the air, false and hollow. I watched her closely, the way her tears fell perfectly, tracing clean lines down a face that still held its makeup, the way her shoulders moved just enough to look sincere. If grief was a performance, Liliana had always been its most convincing actress. Hunter stood near the corner, gripping the back of a chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Sweat glistened on his temple despite the cold air. He kept his eyes on the floor, his jaw clenched, his breathing uneven. The muscles in his neck strained as if he were holding something back, a confession perhaps, or a scream. I saw it then, the faint tremor in his fingers, the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Every detail, every gesture screamed guilt. I had seen that same look in men at the bank when the numbers on a report didn't match their stories, the instinctive fear of being caught. Liliana reached out to him suddenly, placing a hand on his arm. "Hunter," she said softly, "it's all right now. It's over." He flinched at her touch. Just slightly, but enough. Then he nodded too quickly, too tightly. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "It's over." But it wasn't. Not for me, not for him. The air thickened heavy with the kind of silence that hides more than it reveals. I could feel it. Something unspoken, pulsing between them, sharp and alive. Dominic's eyes, though barely open, had seen more than they should have. His gaze had cut through their carefully built lies, and now that truth was leaking into the room like a slow, cold wind. I looked at Hunter. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. The color had drained from his face, leaving only a pale mask of panic and denial. For years I'd thought I knew my son, his voice, his, tells his silences. But the man standing before me wasn't the same. The silence grew unbearable. And in that frozen moment, I understood. Dominic's faint look before collapsing again wasn't confusion or pain. It was a message. A warning carved into the space between us, one that said, "Mom, look closer." Sleep wouldn't come that night. I lay in the dark, the hospital's faint mechanical beeps echoing in my ears long after I'd returned home. Dominic's voice kept replaying in my head, soft, broken, haunting. "Mom, do what she said." The more I turned the words over, the less they sounded like obedience, and the more they felt like a warning, a code, something hidden beneath the surface. By dawn, I stopped trying to rest. I got out of bed, put on my glasses, and sat by the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee that I never drank. Years of managing risk at the bank had taught me one truth: emotion clouds judgment, but instinct, real instinct, comes from patterns you don't yet understand. And something in those 40 words, that single sentence from my son, refused to let me go. I started small. I opened my laptop and logged into the shared phone account. Hunter's recent calls showed strange gaps, long, silent periods followed by bursts of late-night activity. I checked the timestamps. Some of them matched the same nights Liliana had claimed to be away visiting friends. My gut twisted. Next, I moved to the bank statements. Numbers never lie, people do. I scrolled through the transactions, each one neat and ordinary, until I noticed a recurring charge: a luxury car rental company in Pennsylvania, billed under Hunter's card just days before Dominic's accident. I highlighted it, printed the receipt, and slipped it into a folder labeled "Unexplained." But the real proof I knew wouldn't come from numbers alone. It would come from the system I once helped design. Using my old professional contacts, I requested a copy of the insurance claim report from the Ohio State Police. The officer on the line hesitated at first. Privacy restrictions, authorization issues, but I spoke the language of compliance fluently. Within a day, the file landed in my inbox. I opened it and froze. The report showed that the accident had occurred at 5:42 p.m., but the 911 call, the official emergency report, was logged at 6:23. 41 minutes later, I read the line again, my pulse slowing until I could feel it in my throat. 40 minutes. In an accident that severe, that delay could mean life or death. Why wait 40 minutes? What were they doing on that highway while my son's car lay wrecked in a ditch? My mind raced through every possibility, each one darker than the last. I pictured Hunter, his shaking hands, the guilt in his eyes, the way he couldn't look at me when Dominic's name was mentioned. I saw Liliana, her perfect calm, her perfume masking fear. And then, like lightning in the dark, it struck me 40 minutes was enough time to make a call to move evidence to agree on a story. I set the report down and whispered to myself, "All right, Dominic, I'll do what she said, but this time, on my terms." It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening. I was cleaning out the old storage room, something I'd avoided for months, when my hand brushed against a dusty metal toolbox on the bottom shelf. Inside, beneath tangled wires and a cracked tape measure, I found Hunter's old phone. The battery was swollen, the screen dark, but the memory card was still inside. For a long minute, I just stared at it, frozen. It shouldn't have been there. He'd told me he threw it away years ago. I held it in my palm, feeling the cold weight of truth I hadn't yet seen. Part of me hesitated. I was his mother, after all. But the voice in my head whispered louder than guilt. He's hiding something. The next morning, I took the phone to a digital recovery center downtown. The technician, a young man with tired eyes and coffee-stained fingers, examined it carefully. "Ma'am," he said, glancing up at me, "if we recover this, it might contain private or sensitive material. Are you sure you want to see what's inside?" I didn't blink. "I don't care what's private," I said evenly. "I just want the truth." He nodded, inserted the memory card into a reader, and began the process. For nearly an hour, the only sound was the faint hum of the computer. My heart thudded in rhythm with the loading bar. When the files finally appeared, the young man hesitated. "Do you want to look at them yourself?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said. "Show me everything." The first photo appeared. Liliana and Hunter sitting in a cafe, smiling. The timestamp 2 weeks before the accident. Another photo loaded the two of them in a car, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The final one made my stomach twist. Taken in the lobby of a hotel in Pittsburgh, dated exactly 2 days before Dominic's crash. Her hair was tied back, his hand around her waist. They weren't family in that photo. They were something else entirely. Then came the messages. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through the recovered text history. Short-coded exchanges, A&H forever. Just one weekend of freedom. Tell him the truth after the trip. The last message froze me. After the trip. The accident had happened right after that weekend. They never got the chance to tell Dominic, or maybe they never intended to. I sat there in silence, staring at the glowing screen as the technician quietly stepped away, giving me space. The images burned into my mind like evidence carved in fire. 40 minutes delayed, a phone hidden, a secret love. The accident hadn't been fate. It was consequence. I met with Robert Hale on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of day when the sky looked like paper and the air carried the weight of something unfinished. Robert had been my attorney for over 20 years, the man who handled my retirement paperwork, the sale of my first house, and most importantly, the drafting of my will. When he saw me walk into his office clutching a thick folder, he stood up slowly, concern already etched into his face. "Gloria," he said, motioning for me to sit. "You look like someone who hasn't slept in days." "I haven't," I admitted, setting the folder on his desk. "And after you see what's inside, you'll understand why." I opened it and began to explain the accident. Liliana's return, the supposed inheritance claim, the photos, the text messages. I showed him everything I'd uncovered from Hunter's phone. Robert listened in silence, occasionally jotting notes, his brow tightening as the story unfolded. When I finished, he sat back, took off his glasses, and exhaled slowly. "Gloria," he said carefully, "if that child is biologically Dominic's, then by Ohio law, he has a legitimate right to a share of the estate no matter the mother's behavior." He paused, his tone shifting. "But if that document she presented is falsified, and she knowingly claimed paternity under false pretenses, that's a felony. Fraud at the very least. Possibly conspiracy." I nodded, already expecting the answer. "I don't want revenge," I said quietly. "I just want the truth and protection for what Dominic built." He gave a firm nod. Then we'll do this the right way. You'll need legally admissible evidence. Start by duplicating the messages with certified timestamps. I'll prepare a request to extract verified data from Hunter's cloud account. It must go through proper legal channels to hold up in court. And one more thing. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Get a DNA test discreetly. If the child isn't Dominic's, we'll expose everything in one strike. I hesitated the thought of testing a baby's blood, twisting something in my chest. But logic won. Robert was right. Emotion had no place in this kind of war. He handed me a form printed in neat legal type. Sign this. It's an authorization to initiate an estate protection procedure. It'll freeze every asset tied to Dominic's trust. No withdrawals, no name changes, no new beneficiaries until the case is resolved. I took the pen, my hand steady. With one stroke, I signed it. Robert looked at me for a long moment, then said softly, "You were always sharp, Gloria. Now you're also dangerous in the best possible way." For the first time in months, I felt something close to power cold, deliberate and precise. I moved like a woman walking a tightrope, steady and careful, because one wrong step would undo everything. The beanie Liliana had left on the nightstand was small and soft, the way babies sleep, with it folded at the back. I waited until the house was empty, then slipped upstairs, took the hat, and tucked it into a sealed envelope. I did not think about guilt or about how it might feel to take something from a sleeping child. I thought only of evidence and of the precise, cold justice that paperwork can deliver. Using contacts from years at the bank and from the lawyer I trusted, I arranged a discreet meeting with a private genetics lab. I did not call it an investigation. I called it precaution, because the world is kinder to a phrase that sounds reasonable. At the lab, a woman in gloves opened the envelope, and I watched the tiny curls of hair fall onto a sterile tray. She told me in a voice that tried to be professional that a hair with a root could be used for testing and that results would take a few days. I left without a word, though my palms were wet. I already had Dominic's blood sample in a sealed file at the hospital from the initial intake after the crash. It was there because of routine tests, because the hospital keeps a record, and because I had spent so many years trusting systems to be orderly. The technician at the hospital signed the release quietly after Robert called. That quiet cooperation felt like a small victory. I wrapped both samples and put them in a lockbox until the lab called. The call came on a Wednesday late in the afternoon. I remember the sound of the phone on the kitchen table, the way its ring seemed suddenly loud and intrusive in my quiet house. The lab technician spoke carefully. The words were simple, clinical, and then absolute. Probability of paternity 0.00%. The room tilted, but my hand did not. I folded the printout along the creases as if folding a map, and then I walked to the safe. I slipped the paper between other files and locked it with a soft, final click. For a long minute, I simply breathed. The truth was no longer a rumor swirling at the edges of my days. The truth sat on paper, exact and merciless. Because Dominic and Hunter are fraternal twins, their DNA diverges enough to offer clarity, and the lab spelled it out without drama. The child was not Dominic's. The child was Hunter's. That realization did not make me shout. It made me calm. I am old enough to know that fury is public and often useless, while cold patience is private and lethal. I told myself that truth does not need to shout. It only needs to be presented at the right moment. So I folded another plan inside that quiet chest. I would pretend to be convinced to give the appearance of cooperation, to let their confidence grow like a fire they believed they had tamed. I would sign papers if required. I would say the words if needed, all in order to watch them make the next mistakes. I closed the safe and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I did not drink. Outside, the afternoon was ordinary birds moving between bare branches. Inside, the game shifted. I had proof, and proof changes everything. The next move would be mine and mine alone. That night, the hospital smelled of antiseptic and late coffee. Everything washed in that clean, unbearable light. I pushed open the door and felt the room hold its breath. Dominic lay there with his eyes more open than they had been in months, pupils tracking me the way a child tracks a parent coming in from the cold. When he saw me, he reached with a slow, desperate motion and gripped my hand like a man who had just found the shore after being lost at sea. I sat down my knees, remembering how to bend for him, and I let the silence do its work for a moment. I told him about the phone, about the photos, and the messages that had stared up at me from a screen about the delayed 911 report and the $20,000 transfer. With each sentence, I watched his face fold in on itself. He blinked once, twice, and then he spoke in a voice that had the ache of someone climbing out of a deep hole. He said that he had remembered enough to know what had happened on the road. He said that before the crash, Hunter had confessed to sleeping with Liliana, and that the confession had been a knife in his chest. He said that he could not bear the betrayal, that he had turned the wheel to get away from that unbearable knowledge, and that the rest had blurred into metal and glass and the sound of tearing. Hearing him say it in that thin, raw voice broke something loose inside me. I let my other hand close over his feeling bone and skin and the small heat that meant he was still very much alive. Tears came because they had to come, because the world had become too sharp to hold back the shape of sorrow and anger at once. I told him how I had gone through the records, how I had found the test results. I watched as his eyes filled slowly, clean and terrible. He mouthed words that were hardly more than breath. He said that he did not want Hunter to be destroyed, that he loved his brother despite everything, and that the child, whatever the sin that created him, must be protected. The mixture of his compassion and his confession steadied me. It made the plan take on a new shape. I whispered that I had the lab report, that the probability of paternity was 0, and his fingers tightened as if to say thank you and forgive me in the same squeeze. He looked at me with that old, stubborn clarity that used to make me trust him implicitly. He told me to expose them, but to protect the child. He said the words with effort and with a grief that was almost audible in how his lips formed the syllables. So I sat there in the cold hospital light, listening to the machines breathe, feeling my son look at me like he had looked when he was small and afraid, and I made a decision. My response would not be sudden rage or dramatic fury. It would be methodical, legal, and precise. It would be the slow opening of curtains so that the world could see what had been hidden. I promised him silently that I would not let the truth be buried, and I promised that I would keep the child safe from the consequences of adult sins. The promise felt like a vow and like work that needed tools. I closed my hand around his and said nothing more, then because speaking would shape the next move, and I wanted it to be measured and exact. The night of the celebration felt almost unreal, too. Polished, too perfect, the kind of night that hides something sharp beneath the silverware. The house smelled of roasted lamb and roses, every corner lit by soft amber candles. The long dining table gleamed under the chandelier, set with crystal glasses and white hydrangeas that caught the light like tiny stars. It had been weeks since Dominic came home from the hospital, and everyone said the same thing. "It's a miracle." I smiled when they said it, though deep inside, I knew miracles were just well-executed plans that people didn't see coming. Family and friends filled the room. Cousins from Columbus the Hale, couple from next door. Even Mr. Dalton, the family's bank advisor. At the far end, the family lawyer, Robert Hale, sat quietly sipping water instead of wine. He caught my glance, once a brief nod. We both knew what this night was really for. Then came Liliana. She swept in like a flame in her red silk dress, the baby perched prettily on her hip, as if she were posing for a magazine cover. Her laughter floated across the table, practiced and effortless, the kind that makes people lean in. To family, she toasted, raising her glass, her eyes glittering with confidence. To new beginnings, and to securing our children's future. Every word was laced with purpose. She moved gracefully from guest to guest, pouring wine, whispering pleasantries, her manicured fingers brushing shoulders. Every few sentences she would drop the same words: inheritance, estate, trust fund. Each time the room shifted slightly, polite smiles, freezing conversations stalling just for a breath. I sat at the head of the table watching. My dress was simple black silk pearls, calm authority. I wanted her to believe she was winning. I wanted everyone to believe this was a reconciliation, a warm family reunion. That was the beauty of appearances. People never look for the blade if you're smiling. Dominic sat beside me, still pale but stronger, his hand trembling slightly as he held his glass. He kept his eyes mostly down, playing his role in the performance. Hunter was across the table, fidgeting with his fork, avoiding both my gaze and Dominic's. The distance between them felt wider than the table itself. Liliana approached me last, her heels clicking softly against the marble. "Mother," she said sweetly, the word now sounding like a business title. "I'm so glad we can all be together again." Dominic's recovery. It's a sign, isn't it, that we should start fresh as a family and ensure everything is properly arranged for the baby's future. The guest smiled, unaware of the current running beneath the surface. I met her eyes, smiled back, a slow, measured smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Of course, dear," I said. "Tonight is about family, and I've made sure everything is properly arranged." The room erupted in laughter again, clinking glasses, the illusion of harmony restored. But beneath the sound of champagne and piano music, the air trembled with quiet electricity. Every piece was on the board now, every player in their place. And as the candles flickered in the crystal reflections, I thought, let the show begin. Liliana leaned forward slightly, her voice dripping with that soft, polished sweetness she used whenever she wanted something. The chatter around the table hushed almost naturally, as if the air itself knew to listen. She smiled, lowering her eyes just enough to seem humble, her tone honeyed and gentle. "Mother," she began, "I only wish for you to add the baby's name to the will soon. That way, if anything ever happens, you can rest easy, knowing the assets stay in the family." The words hung in the air like perfume, sweet but heavy, impossible to ignore. A few guests nodded approvingly, unaware of the poison laced behind her politeness. "She's right," Gloria, one cousin chimed in with a chuckle. "It's better to settle those things while you're healthy and clear-headed." Another relative added, "Yes, keeps the peace. You never know what happens later." Their laughter mixed with the clinking of glasses, light and careless. I could feel every eye at the table slide toward me, waiting, curious to see if the matriarch would yield or if I would push back. Across from me, Dominic sat pale and fragile, his hand resting weakly on the tablecloth. He looked confused, still recovering, still too kind to see the trap tightening around him. He didn't notice how Liliana's fingers tightened around her wineglass each time someone mentioned the will. I turned to her slowly, allowing the silence to stretch long enough for the tension to become visible. I let my smile return, measured and calm, the kind of smile people mistake for agreement. "You're right," I said softly. "Family should be secure." Liliana's eyes brightened, triumph flickering too soon. She straightened, thinking she had won, while Hunter avoided looking at either of us, pretending to be absorbed in cutting his steak. I continued, my voice steady. "And you're also right about peace of mind. There's no need to delay. In fact, I paused, taking a slow sip from my glass, letting the room fall utterly quiet. We can do it tonight, right here, in front of everyone. That way everything will be fair and transparent. The sound that followed wasn't quite applause, more of a collective exhale. Someone murmured, "That's very wise, Gloria," while another said, "See, that's why she's always in control." Liliana blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't expected compliance. Not this easily. Her smile faltered for just half a second before she regained composure, nodding eagerly. "That's wonderful, Mother. I knew you'd see reason." I smiled again, folding my napkin neatly on the table, careful, deliberate. "Reason," I repeated, tasting the word like a promise. Dominic looked at me, uncertainty shadowing his features, as if something in my tone unsettled him. I met his eyes briefly, just enough for him to know I had everything under control. The guests resumed their chatter, toasting again, clinking glasses. But beneath the laughter, something had shifted. They thought the matter was settled. Liliana thought she had won. Only I knew the truth. Tonight's agreement wasn't surrender. It was the match I had just struck, and the fire was about to spread. I had rehearsed this evening in my head 100 different ways, and now it moved like a slow, inevitable tide. The dining room smelled of roast and wine and candle wax. People laughed and leaned into one another, unaware that every gesture could be read like a move in a game. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder marked "Last Will Amendment," handed it to Robert with a smile that felt like a ruler tapping a table, and watched him pretend surprise in the way we had practiced. The paper inside was blank, in the signature lines a prepared shell that would look official the moment ink met it. Spencer had made it so precise and harmless to anyone who did not know the secret between us. I placed the folder on the table and called for attention. The room quieted because attention always obeys authority when authority is calm. I spoke about gratitude and recovery, about family and the need for clarity, and my voice was warm while my hands moved like a conductor's, guiding the cadence. Then I said that to avoid future disputes, I would sign a formal amendment tonight in front of everyone for transparency and peace. The words landed exactly where I wanted them. Liliana's smile grew wide enough to be seen across the table. Her fingers trembled in the way I had seen in the photos, the tremor that comes with a certainty so near you can taste it. Hunter shifted in his chair and kept looking at his plate. Dominic still did not understand what the waves around him meant, and that was a mercy. Robert placed the blank amendment before me and passed the pen with exaggerated solemnity. I took it slowly, feeling the weight of years and the coolness of the ink. I signed my name with a deliberate hand while everyone watched, feeling each stroke like a small verdict. When I set the pen down, a polite applause broke out, and glasses were lifted. Liliana rose the baby secure against her eyes, alight with a triumph that made the air sweet and dangerous. She moved through the room, offering toasts, while I let the script play itself out. At her elbow, Hunter passed her a small amber bottle so subtle that nobody noticed but me. She slipped away behind a potted ficus, laughing softly, and he leaned close and whispered something I did not hear. She dipped a finger into the bottle, and then with hands that looked steady but were not, she returned to the table and sat down beside me. Her lips brushed my cheek when she offered the toast, and her voice was syrupy. I smiled and raised my glass to family, our future the child. The crystal chimed, and lights caught on the facets. For a moment, I watched Liliana's hand flirt with the rim of my glass, precise, careful. Then she managed a movement that was almost imperceptible, a drop or two into the wine I had just lifted. She saw it, thinking fate had favored her. Hunter watched with a fixed face, the sweat at his temple glinting like a private confession. The room continued its light conversation, unaware of the tiny betrayal sitting at the heart of our celebration. I tasted the wine full of warmth and thought only that the game had begun and that everyone had just walked onto the stage I had quietly set. The glass was halfway to my lips when the sharp sound of the front door unlocking cut through the room. It wasn't the sound of a guest arriving late. It was heavier, deliberate, official. Every head turned. The dining room door swung open and two uniformed officers stepped inside, followed by Spencer Reed in his gray suit, calm as a man who had just finished a game he knew he would win. The laughter froze in midair. Mrs. Liliana Porter, the taller officer, announced, his voice steady and echoing against the marble floor. "You are under arrest for attempted murder and financial fraud. The entire act you just performed has been recorded on hidden cameras provided by the homeowner's cooperation." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Liliana blinked once, twice, like someone waking from a dream she didn't like. The color drained from her face. The wine glass slipped from her hand and shattered against the tile red, spilling outward like a wound opening on the floor. Hunter jumped to his feet, the chair crashing behind him. "Wait, this isn't—" he started. But one of the officers moved faster, twisting his arm back and snapping on the cuffs before he could finish. The metallic click echoed through the silence. Spencer walked calmly to the head of the table, his polished shoes making no sound on the rug. He set a tablet down in front of me, pressed play, and turned the screen toward the guests. The room filled with the faint hum of recorded audio. Then the unmistakable image appeared. Liliana leaning over my glass, her hand delicate, her expression calculated. Hunter's hand appeared next, sliding a small amber vial across the table. They whispered, laughed, a soft, conspiratorial sound, now magnified into something monstrous. Someone gasped. Someone else dropped a fork. Beyond that, there was only silence, thick and suffocating, broken only by the quiet trickle of spilled wine dripping from the edge of the table to the stone floor below. Liliana stumbled backward, shaking her head violently. "No, it's not what it looks like," she stammered, eyes darting toward Hunter, then to Dominic, who sat frozen in disbelief. Dominic's hand trembled on the table, the veins rising beneath his skin. He whispered his brother's name once, and Hunter couldn't look at him. The officers moved closer, reading her rights in calm, practiced tones. Spencer stayed still, watching with that measured look lawyers wear when justice has already been served. He met my eyes briefly, the unspoken acknowledgement between us, as clear as glass the plan had worked. Liliana's cries turned high and desperate, her voice cracking as she pleaded, but the handcuffs clinked, final and cold. Hunter said nothing, only bowed his head as if the weight of his own choices had finally found him. I sat there quietly, the matriarch at the head of a broken table, my wine untouched. Around me the world had erupted into chaos, yet all I felt was the stillness that comes when truth, long buried, finally floods in unstoppable cleansing, merciless. I rose slowly from my chair, the silk of my dress brushing softly against the floor. The room was so still that even the candles seemed to stop flickering. Liliana stood frozen near the end of the table. Her wrists bound her face, a storm of disbelief and rage. I met her eyes, the same eyes that once pretended affection, now stripped of their performance. My voice, when it came, was calm, but sharp enough to slice through the silence. "You couldn't harm me," I said evenly, each word deliberate. "Because the one thing you never learned was how to love honestly." Her body tensed. The facade cracked all at once. "I only did it because I was scared," she cried out, her voice trembling, desperate, raw. "I was afraid of losing everything." I stepped closer, the heels of my shoes echoing softly against the marble. "You already have." I told her, my tone steady as the blade of a knife. "Not your money, not your chance at comfort. those can always be rebuilt. What you lost, Liliana, is your character. And no court, no lawyer, no lie can give that back. For a moment, the entire room felt suspended in time. Even the officers paused as though reverence demanded they let truth finish speaking before duty resumed. Then came Dominic's sob. It started small, a quiet fracture in the air, and then it broke open. My son, my once proud, stubborn boy, sank to his knees beside me, clutching my hand like a child again. His shoulders shook as tears streamed down his face. "Mom," he whispered, voice breaking, "I was blind. I believed her lies. I let her turn me against you. I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner." I looked down at him, my own vision blurring. All the anger, all the pain I had buried for months melted into something softer. Not forgiveness yet, but the beginning of it. I bent slightly, placing a hand on his cheek. "You see it now," I murmured. "And that's enough." The officers began to move again. Hunter was the first to be led away, his eyes hollow, his expression defeated. Liliana struggled, shouting his name, her voice rising in panic. "Hunter, say something. Tell them the truth." But he said nothing, only lowered his head as the handcuffs clicked tighter. I watched them both as they were guided past the long dining table, past the crystal glasses, and the remnants of what was once a family celebration. Now it looked more like a courtroom, the evidence still visible, the witnesses still staring the verdict, already written in silence. As the doors closed behind them, I took a deep breath. The night air outside carried faint sirens, and the scent of rain, cleansing and new. The feast had ended, but justice, real justice, had taken its place. And in that quiet, surrounded by broken glass and cold wine, I knew this wasn't revenge. It was revelation. 2 weeks after the chaos of that night, the courthouse in downtown Cuyahoga buzzed with the kind of noise only scandal can summon. Reporters lined the marble steps, cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. The morning headline on every paper and phone screen read, "Lover and brother arrested at family dinner attempted poisoning of elderly matriarch for inheritance." I saw it printed in bold black letters while waiting outside the courtroom, and for a brief moment, I wondered how many times justice had arrived, dressed as humiliation. Inside, the air was colder, quieter. The courtroom smelled faintly of paper coffee and the nervous sweat of truth about to surface. Liliana sat at the defense table in a beige prison jumpsuit, her hair tied back, no trace of her usual perfection. Hunter sat beside her, shackled at the wrists, eyes fixed on the floor. He hadn't looked at me once since that night. When the judge entered, everyone rose. His gavel struck once sharp final. The prosecutor began recounting the events with surgical precision. Forged documents for a will amendment, falsified paternity claims, and an elaborate plan to poison me during a family celebration. Each sentence landed like a hammer, breaking apart whatever remained of their facade. Then came the video. Spencer, seated 2 rows behind me, handed over the digital file that had sealed their fate. The clerk dimmed the lights, and the projector flickered to life. On the screen, in high definition, the living room appeared, my house, my table, my guests. The image zoomed in, Liliana unscrewing a small bottle, Hunter's hand sliding it toward her, their soft laughter like the whisper of sin itself. The room went silent. You could hear the hum of the camera lens focusing. Someone in the audience gasped. Hunter's head dropped lower. He pressed his lips together as if to hold back a lifetime of regret. Liliana, trembling, clasped her hands as the prosecutor asked the question that mattered most. "Mrs. Porter," he said evenly, "do you have anything you wish to say to this court?" For a moment she said nothing. Her shoulders shook, her breath shallow. Then she began to cry. Not the dramatic, manipulative tears she once used to get her way, but real broken sobs that echoed through the chamber. The judge watched, unmoved. She didn't deny a thing. Not the affair, not the forgery, not the poison. Her silence became its own confession. When the prosecutor rested his case, the judge looked toward me. "Mrs. Graham," he said, "thank you for your cooperation. Without your composure and evidence, this court might never have seen the truth." I nodded once. I didn't need thanks. Seeing the truth spoken aloud, not whispered, not suspected but declared, was enough. The gavel struck again. The hearing was over, but the reckoning had only begun. 3 months after the trial began, Dominic walked into the courtroom for the first time. His movements were slow, deliberate, each step a quiet battle between pain and willpower. The room, already tense, seemed to inhale as he entered. The man who had once been carried out of a wreckage now stood upright, pale, thinner, but unmistakably alive. When he reached the witness stand, he looked toward me briefly. I gave him a small nod, not to reassure him, but to remind him that truth, no matter how heavy, was the only thing worth carrying. The bailiff helped him settle into the chair. His hands trembled slightly as he took the oath. When the lawyer asked the first question, his voice was hoarse, unsteady. Yet there was a steadiness beneath it, the kind that comes only after surviving something unspeakable. He began simply. "The night of the accident," he said, his words deliberate, "Hunter told me he'd been with my wife. That it wasn't a one-time mistake. That it had been going on for months." He paused, swallowing hard as though the confession still burned in his throat, even now. "I remember losing control not just of the car, but of myself. I turned the wheel. I don't even know why. I just wanted to escape the sound of his voice. And then I remember the sound of metal crushing, like the world folding in on itself. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Even the reporters stopped writing. Someone in the back sniffled softly. Another person wiped a tear. The air felt sacred, as though the courtroom itself understood that what was being spoken wasn't just testimony. It was the kind of truth that costs pieces of a soul to say aloud. I sat still in my seat, rosary tucked in my palm inside my coat pocket. My fingers traced each bead slowly, as if counting prayers for every word my son spoke. It wasn't anger that filled me anymore, but something quieter, grief for all that had been broken, and gratitude that he still had the courage to stand and speak. The defense attorney hesitated before asking Mr. Graham, "Given the circumstances, would you request leniency for your brother?" Dominic looked up, then really looked up. His eyes red but clear, his voice low, yet firm. "No," he said after a pause. "I don't want revenge. I just want justice." The truth needed to be said, and now it has been. For a long moment, no one moved. The judge leaned back in his chair, the officers stood frozen. Even Hunter, sitting at the defendant's table, couldn't lift his gaze. The courtroom for once felt weightless. And in that fragile silence, I realized something. Justice doesn't always sound like a verdict. Sometimes it sounds like a broken man finally telling the truth. The final day of the trial arrived like the end of a long winter cold, heavy and inevitable. The courtroom was filled to capacity. Every seat taken, every breath held. The air smelled faintly of paper and rain-soaked coats. Reporters crowded the back row, their pens ready, their cameras poised. Spencer sat beside me, silent as stone. Dominic, still pale but stronger, rested a hand over mine. When the judge entered the room, rose in unison. His gavel struck once, the sound slicing through the murmur of whispers. "Court is now in session," he declared. His voice carried the weight of both authority and fatigue, the kind that comes from seeing too many families destroyed by greed. He looked down at the defendants, Liliana and Hunter, standing side by side in front of the bench. She was trembling. He was pale and rigid, jaw clenched. The judge began reading the charges, his tone steady, deliberate, unyielding. Liliana Porter, you are hereby sentenced to 18 years in federal custody. Hunter Graham, 12 years in state prison. Both of you are found guilty of conspiracy to defraud, attempted poisoning of an elder, forgery of legal documents, and obstruction of justice. Each word struck like a bell toll, slow, final, impossible to stop. Liliana gasped, clutching the edge of the table as if it could hold her up. Hunter's head dropped forward, his shoulders collapsing under the weight of what he had done. The courtroom sat frozen. No one spoke. Then the judge added his tone deep and unwavering. Let this stand as a reminder. There is no bloodline above the law. Family ties cannot conceal crime. Justice does not belong to one house or one name, it belongs to truth. For a moment, even the cameras stopped clicking. The words hung in the air, raw and sacred. Hunter finally looked up at me. His eyes, once bright with ambition, were hollow now. Not pleading, not angry, just empty. I didn't flinch. I only shook my head slowly. Not out of rage, but sorrow, the kind that comes when a mother mourns someone still breathing. Then Liliana broke down. The composure she had worn like armor shattered completely. As the bailiff stepped forward with the cuffs, she sobbed uncontrollably, her voice echoing across the silent courtroom. Please, Mother. I'm sorry, I just wanted a better life. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Her words reached me, but I didn't answer. I couldn't. Some betrayals leave no room for language. I simply watched as the handcuffs clicked closed around her wrists, the sound sharp, final, cleaner than any sentence could be. As they were led away, I folded my hands together. Around us, the room stirred back to life, reporters whispering, pens scratching, the machinery of justice turning again. But inside me, there was only silence. The silence of a mother who had lost one son to greed, another to guilt, and a daughter-in-law to her own ambition. The silence that spoke louder than any verdict ever could. The story spread faster than any storm. Within days of the verdict, every newspaper in Ohio, and several beyond, ran the same headline: a family poisoned by greed, the fall of the Grahams. Morning shows debated it. Radio hosts dissected it, and strangers online turned our pain into content. Once people used to point to our family as a model of success, the proud widow, the devoted sons, the picture-perfect daughter-in-law. Now they whispered they had everything and lost it all for a woman's ambition. Outside, photographers camped in front of the courthouse for days. One even tried to take a picture of Dominic leaving physical therapy. He covered his face with his hand and muttered, "Let them have their story, Mom. I just want to live." His voice broke on the word live. Hunter's company released a public statement that afternoon. Effective immediately, Mr. Graham has been terminated due to criminal involvement in ongoing legal proceedings. The email circulated across business networks, shared and reshared with the kind of fascination only tragedy can provoke. Meanwhile, Liliana became the internet's favorite villain. Social media turned her into a symbol of greed and deceit, her photos plastered with captions like, "The woman who poisoned her mother-in-law for an inheritance." Some called her the Red Widow, mocking the crimson dress she had worn the night of the arrest. Her house in downtown Cleveland was seized to cover legal costs, and her luxury car was auctioned off within a week. For years, she had chased wealth believing it would make her untouchable. Now her name itself was worthless, a cautionary tale whispered over dinner tables. Hunter's bank accounts were frozen under the Elder Justice Act, which protected victims of financial abuse. The court ruled that all shared family assets, the house, the savings, the retirement accounts, would revert to me until further legal notice. It wasn't victory. It was survival. The noise outside grew deafening. News vans parked near the neighborhood, reporters shouting questions whenever I stepped outside. I stopped answering the phone. Even well-meaning friends called not to offer comfort, but to ask for details, hungry for the next revelation. So I withdrew. I left the big house in Lakewood, moving to the smaller property by the lake, the one my husband and I once dreamed would be our quiet place after retirement. There, no one knocked, no one questioned. Only the wind spoke, brushing across the water like a whisper of forgiveness. Some nights, I sat on the porch holding my tea, watching the moon ripple across the lake's surface. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. Let the world talk, I thought. Let them analyze, condemn, and forget. I no longer needed to prove anything. The law had spoken, and so had life itself. The months that followed felt quieter, not peaceful yet, but quieter, like a storm that had finally passed, leaving only the hum of the wind through broken branches. Dominic was walking again, driving short distances and slowly rebuilding the pieces of his life that could still be salvaged. The doctors called his recovery miraculous, but I knew better. It wasn't a miracle. It was survival, earned through pain, guilt, and the stubborn refusal to give up. He decided to move back into the house, the same house that had witnessed betrayal, secrets, and justice. Now it became something else, a place of rebuilding. He turned the guest room into a nursery. The baby's name was Eli Graham. He wasn't Dominic's by blood, but by love, by choice, by redemption. When Dominic first held him, his hands trembled, but not from weakness. It was the tremor of someone who finally understood that love doesn't always come from what we inherit, but from what we choose to protect. The court granted me legal guardianship, official papers signed and sealed by the same justice system that once nearly tore our family apart. I became the custodian of Eli's inheritance and his future, tasked with guiding him until adulthood. But no signature could mend what had been broken inside me. Sometimes when I watched Dominic feeding the baby, humming softly to calm him, I felt both pride and sorrow swell in my chest. He was a father now, not to his own blood, but to an innocent child born from betrayal. Yet maybe that was life's strange way of rewriting pain into purpose. The neighbors stopped gossiping eventually, the headlines faded, and the world moved on to newer scandals. But some nights when the house was silent and the lake wind brushed the curtains, the past returned in fragments, the sound of glass shattering the echo of Hunter's silence, the plea in Liliana's voice. Those ghosts never really left. I tried not to chase them away anymore. Instead, I learned to sit with them, to listen, to forgive without erasing. Every afternoon, I sat by the window, the same spot where sunlight hit the wooden desk just right, and opened my journal. The pages smelled faintly of ink and tea. I never wrote much, just one line each day. A promise, a confession, a truth. I didn't need revenge. I only needed the truth to speak, and it did. When I closed the notebook, I felt lighter. Outside, Dominic's laughter mingled with Eli's baby giggles in the garden. The world, despite everything, kept turning. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to breathe not in triumph, but in quiet peace. A few quiet months passed after the sentencing, and life began to take a gentler shape. The house by the lake, once just a retreat for weekends, became our permanent home. It wasn't large like the old family estate, but it was peaceful. The air smelled of pine and rain, and the mornings came with mist rising over still water. I moved here with Dominic and the baby, leaving behind the echoes of courtroom doors and flashing cameras. The world had taken what it wanted, the story, the spectacle, but here we could finally breathe. Dominic's recovery continued slowly. Every morning he walked the gravel path behind the house, leaning on his cane, but smiling more often. Sometimes I caught him watching Eli play on the porch, his face calm, no longer clouded by anger or shame. That child, innocent, unaware of the chaos that brought him here, had somehow become the quiet bridge between what was lost and what remained. One afternoon, as sunlight scattered across the water, I wrote in my journal again. The pages had carried my grief for too long. It was time they carried something else. I wrote, "Forgiveness doesn't make me weak. It makes me strong enough not to let hatred own me." Dominic came to sit beside me. He watched Eli toddle toward the edge of the dock, laughing at the sound of the waves. "Mom," he said softly, "do you ever think we'll be normal again?" I smiled faintly. "Normal is overrated," I replied. "We have peace. That's better." He nodded, eyes glistening. I could see in him the man his father once was, not perfect, but kind, tempered by fire. Later that evening, as I tucked Eli into his crib, the little boy reached out, grabbing my finger. His small hand was warm, steady. Dominic stood at the doorway, watching silently. I turned to him and said, "Blood can betray us, but love never does." Outside, the lake shimmered beneath the setting sun. The world still carried its noise, its gossip, its hunger for tragedy. But here, only the truth remained quiet, unmovable, eternal. If you have ever seen an elder mistreated, silenced, or taken advantage of, don't stay quiet. Speak their truth. Share their story. Because justice doesn't fade with age, and the truth, no matter how long it's buried, always finds its way back to the light.